Well, hello everybody and welcome to this live webcast, which is all about how to speak at a funeral. It's one of those very difficult subjects that people don't really like to think about until they're actually faced with doing it. And often that's the problem, as we're not prepared. The key to speaking confidently in public is having practice in doing it. And if you keep putting that off, if you don't take up any opportunities to speak at work or at parties or on other occasions, and then you are asked to speak at a funeral and you don't have any experience, you may not feel confident in saying yes to that. And that's a huge shame because it can be incredibly rewarding and can also be part of the grieving process, a really important part if you do take part. So my name is Julie Howell and I'm a public speaking trainer at Giraffe Spence Public Speaking, and you're going to be hearing from me for the next 40 minutes. This is also an interactive session, so there's the opportunity to ask questions and make comments as we go along, and I will answer as many of those as possible. I've also had a few sent through to me via email, so we'll be picking those up as we go along. If you have a look at the chat room window that you've got there, the software you're using to listen to me just now, you'll see the opportunity to ask questions or to chat. Please put through any comments or questions at any time, and I will answer those to the best of my ability. Just a word before we really get started. This is a live session, and as we're relying on technology and the internet, it's always possible that the technology can go wrong and let us down. And if that does happen, please don't worry. I am recording the session and I will make it available to you afterwards. So if suddenly everything goes quiet, it probably is down to the technology. And so don't worry too much, please. I'll make sure that you do get a recording of it afterwards. It is just me on the session, so let's get started. How to speak at a funeral then? Well, it may be that you've never been to a funeral before. I've got a picture up on the screen now of a very famous funeral. There's Elton John there singing at Princess Diana's funeral a few years ago. And you've probably seen funerals on the television or in films. It's a very famous funeral scene at the film Four Weddings and a Funeral. I have to tell you though, if that's your only experience of funerals, you're in for a surprise. When you go to an actual funeral, what you will find is that you're very, very limited for time. When it's a great big funeral, you may have seen Whitney Houston's funeral that was broadcast and seemed to go on all day earlier in the year. Those are the exception and not the rule. Many funerals these days, and very often they're conducted at crematoria, are only about 20 to 30 minutes tops. If you're asked to speak at a funeral, therefore, you may only be given as much as 3 minutes to speak. So there is no time to recite a great long poem or to go into great detail with lots and lots of anecdotes about how much the person meant to you. It really is a time to be thinking very carefully about how you're going to structure the talk that you give. So how do we go about that? Well, crucially, before you start, you need to speak to the person who's in charge of organising the funeral service and find out who else is speaking, where in the running order you appear, so who you're speaking after and who you're speaking before, and exactly how much time you're going to have to speak, because it is crucial. The one place where you cannot overrun is a funeral. So over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to speak to you about some of the crucial things to remember, your top priorities, the things you have to keep in mind, and what you can do to keep your emotions under control, because it is a very emotional event, but you want to make sure that you can say the things that you're planning to say. So let's move on then. So if asked to speak at a funeral, these are the top 3 things to remember. This first one is really, really important. You know, your top priority is this. It's to give comfort to the other people in their grief. So it's actually not about you. And it's not about the person who has passed away either. It's not them that you're addressing. You're there speaking to people who are in a time of great grief and sadness and probably some confusion and bewilderment as well, in order to give them some support. Keep coming back to that thought when you're thinking about what it is you're going to say at a funeral, and that will stand you in good stead. So it's not about you and all the things you may want to say. If there are things that you want to say and you want to express them to other people, there's a better time to do that. It might be that you and some friends or some of the family members may put together a memorial service or a memorial occasion, maybe around the scattering of ashes. That might be a better time for that. A funeral is actually a pretty formal affair. It is possible to have some less formal funerals these days, particularly if you have a non-religious ceremony. But on the whole, you need to Stick to time, remember it's respectful, and remember that you're addressing the mourners. That's the chief mourners, which tend to be the family and close friends, and also acquaintances of the person who has died. It's not about saying all the things that you want to say on this occasion. Secondly, you absolutely must stick to time. And it's so crucial that you find out in advance exactly how much time you have available to you. Now, it's possible that the person who is putting the funeral together isn't sure. If that's the case, it may be that you need to speak to the minister, if it's that sort of funeral, or the undertaker who might be organising it. But you need to know exactly how much time you have, and you must not overrun. It's crucial. And there's a very good reason for that, because there will be other funerals following that day, whether it's a burial or a cremation. And on the whole, they tend to be cremations these days, though it does depend on the religious views of the people that are organising the funeral. But you need to find out exactly how much time you have and plan to speak for slightly less than that time, just in case there's anything that causes you to overrun. And thirdly, your emotions can surprise you. It is a very bewildering time. You may think, well, I'm not the sort of person who cries and I don't cry easily in front of other people. That may well be true. But when you're standing at a funeral, you're standing in a highly emotionally charged environment. You may be standing next to a coffin if you've never done that before. The emotions can really take you by surprise. And remember that you'll have sat through other people speaking who may have become upset before it's your turn to speak, and that can affect you. And also that you are facing out onto an audience that is upset. You'll be looking at people who are feeling very emotional, who may be crying, who may be feeling very angry. Don't underestimate the effect that that may have on you. Prepare for that. Have a think about that before the time of the funeral service, so that you're really prepared. We're going to go into all of these issues in some more detail now. We're going to start by thinking about what to say and how to say it. And again, coming back to thinking about the people who are present. There are going to be family there, more than likely than not. However, the type of family members that are there will vary depending on how old the person is who's passed away. If it's a younger person, there may be parents there. If it's an older person, there may be no parents there, but there may be children. And there will be friends, and there's this kind of strange hierarchy when somebody has died. There are close family and friends there, but there will also be friends who may not be close friends to the person who's died now, but have been in the past, and they may be deeply upset and may bring in emotions of regret because they weren't there in the final years of somebody's life and weren't able to express their feelings, and now they may be feeling it's kind of too late, so they may be very distressed, and the funeral may be the first time they felt that they could cry in that atmosphere. And there may be colleagues there as well. It's a strange thing with people who work with the person who has died, particularly if that person was of working age when they died, because they may not feel they have the right to feel upset and may need permission from the people who are speaking at the funeral service to express how they feel and to cry. I often feel the best funeral service is where everybody's crying, because then everybody is feeling that they can express their emotions. It's very difficult when it's just the key family members who are crying, because a funeral service is there for everybody to express how they're feeling. So bear in mind that you're talking to many different groups of people at a funeral. Let's move on to our next slide. What to say? Well, this is an opportunity for you to remember the person and help everybody else in the room to remember the person through your own recollections. Chances are that you've been invited to speak at the funeral. It may be that you haven't, and you've asked the family if you could speak and they've said yes, and that's a lovely thing to do too. And many people shy away from the opportunity to speak at a funeral. So you got this far and you've been invited to speak, or you've offered, and that wish has been granted by the family. So what do you talk about? Well, think about the things that you want to say to the person or about the person that you're speaking about. it's got to be something that's appropriate. You know, I've been at funerals where people have spoken about things that are happy memories for them and funny recollections about the person, but think about the family there and what they know about the person. It's not a time for revelations. I have been at a funeral where somebody's given a lovely speech about their friend who's died and about how much fun they used to have smoking together at school behind the bike sheds. Well, that's lovely, but if that's a revelation to the family, it can be awkward. I've then seen the family afterwards have met people going up, other members of the family going up to them and saying, I didn't know that they smoked, and well, they don't smoke. You know, it's caused a bit of embarrassment. So just double check that the things that you're planning to say are appropriate to everybody who's there. They might bring a kind of a warm feeling of recognition for some, but not necessarily for all. So be a bit choosy about the things that you're going to say, and if you're not sure if they're appropriate, then it's a good idea to double check with somebody else who knew the person, just to make sure, you know, do you think it's all right for me to say this? So you're making sure that you're saying something that is appropriate for the family as well as for close friends and acquaintances. It's also a good idea to find out what other people are saying. Now have a look at that running order before the day and see who else is speaking and find out what they're going to be saying. It might be that you can provide some light and shade to the funeral speeches. If there is people speaking there who are relatives, you don't try and say the same kind of things that they're going to be saying. What they're saying will be very personal and poignant to them. If you are a relative of the person who's died, then you may want to say something that's recollects growing up together, and that's something that everybody can take some comfort from. If you just work with the person, you didn't know them as a child, then obviously it's not appropriate to say anything about what might have happened when they were a small kid. Instead, talk about something that happened that you shared together, an experience that you had, that will give some comfort and recollection to people who knew them when they were older, and indeed to the family who didn't know them as a co-worker. It might be very comforting to hear some of your experiences. What you don't want to do is just say something that everybody else has said, that's repeating what everybody else has heard. You do have that 3 to 5 minutes. Okay, make them count. It can be really helpful when structuring your talk to start by talking about how you met the person. So talking about, well, you know, if it was a colleague, talking about, I remember when they first started working with me and what it was like when they were new at the place of work, and then over time they gained confidence and what that was like and what they were like to work with, and, you know, and be honest about them. Then moving on, it can be really nice to share a gently amusing story that most people in the room will be able to relate to. So nothing that was too humiliating or you know, inappropriate drinking stories. This isn't a best man speech. This is remembering somebody's life. So if there's something that's gently amusing, where most people in the room will think, oh, yes, I can imagine that happening to that person, and that would be a lovely thing to share. And when it comes to your kind of summing up, it's a good idea to keep your summing up words fairly brief. There's an important reason for that. It can become a very emotional time for you when you're doing your summing up, because this may be kind of in your mind. You may be getting through your speech quite happily, saying all the things that you plan to say. However, in your mind, when you know that you're coming up to the very final thing, it really is an end point for you, not just the end of what you're planning to say. It's the end of your standing up there, addressing your friend, and it's kind of your friend's family, and it's also the last time where you may be standing up there saying something about your friend, and that sense of closure may weigh very heavily on you. So when planning what to say, keep it light. You've got to remember that in that last sentence, that may really be where you start to feel emotion taking over. We'll talk about emotion a little bit more shortly, but try and keep it as light as you can. It will be poignant no matter what you say. It may be helpful actually to have your very final words in the form of a favourite song, lines from a favourite song, or from a poem. If I can share with you, that's what I did at my father's funeral. Myself and my brother both spoke at my father's funeral. He died fairly young. He was just 67, and it was expected. My father knew that he was dying, and so was able to tell us the kind of things that he wanted to happen at his funeral. But when it came to speaking, we chose a poem actually a Robert Burns poem, as my family is Scottish, that my brother and I both read out together. Now, that was very poignant because it was me and my brother, two children speaking together. It was also a poem that wasn't about my dad, so it wasn't too difficult for us to read. It's a well-known poem that a lot of people would recognise. We're a Scottish family, so a lot of people there who were present at the funeral recognised it. It was a very well-attended funeral. There were over 100 people, and I encouraged anybody who knew the words to the poem to speak them along with us, and also discouraged people who didn't just to be quiet so that we could read it through. What you'll notice is it's quite a short poem. It just has 8 lines there, but 8 lines can be about a minute when you're reading it out at a fairly slow pace during a funeral. So a poem like this is a nice idea. When you're researching poems for a funeral, don't go for anything longer than this. 8 lines is enough. If you go for any more than 8 lines, you may regret it because you will overrun. There's a real risk of that and not be able to finish. And the last thing that you want is for the vicar to be, the minister to be giving you a dig in the elbows, a dig in the ribs with his elbow, saying you need to stop speaking now before you have finished. So take into account how long it will take to read the poem when you're doing that. Let's move on to talk about keeping to time. Really, really important. Whenever you're doing any talk, I always suggest that you find out how long you have to speak for and plan to speak for 20% less of that time. It's always different when you're actually doing a speech, any kind of speech in real time. So make sure that you've got a buffer just in case you overrun, you speak slower than you think you're going to, or there are any kind of interruptions that slow you down. Usually at a funeral it is about 3 minutes. I would suggest that you prepare to speak for 2.5 minutes, and usually at any kind of public speaking I will say don't over-rehearse it. The funerals are the exception to that. Rehearse, 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 and keep on rehearsing and keep timing yourself. Time it and make sure you get it, if it's 3 minutes, to 2.5 minutes. And if it's going over all the time, then you need to cut it down. You cannot overrun. There will be other funerals following that day. You cannot cut into theirs. At worst, the family may be charged for that. And also the people who are following you may be told they can't speak because you spoke for too long and we need to move things along. So it's really, really important to keep to time. What I also recommend that you do is have your speech on a piece of paper with you. Now that will help you if you become distracted, if you become choked up, if you lose your place, if you dry up, if you become lost at all within your speech. Go back to your piece of paper. It will keep you to time. It will also make the minister or whoever is conducting the service very happy, because if you do become so choked up with emotion, and we're going to talk about emotion shortly, if you do become choked up, the minister can take over. If you have your speech written out on a piece of paper, the minister can take over from you. Now this is quite a handy thing actually, because certainly for me, knowing that the minister might take over and read my words is enough to help me keep control of my emotion and keep me running to time, because I don't want the minister speaking my words, and I'm sure you don't either, but it's so important to have that backup just in case it does become too difficult for you. So do make sure you have your speech on a piece of paper, and I cannot stress strongly enough to you, you cannot overrun at a funeral. It is the one time that you cannot overrun. It is the one time where underrunning is a very, very, very good thing. Moving on then to talk about emotions, and this is the thing that troubles most people when thinking about speaking at a funeral, is their emotions, and how do you keep them under control. This may sound like a strange thing to say, but be prepared for your own emotions to surprise you, particularly if you've never been to a funeral before. You may feel in the run-up to the funeral, in the few days up to it, you may feel fine, whether or not you know the person who has died really well, or if they were more of an acquaintance to you. That period between somebody dying, even if you were prepared for it, and the funeral is very surreal. Time seems to move at a different pace. There may be some feeling of relief, particularly if the person was particularly ill before that died. There may be a feeling of relief and even victory that the person has been able to pass over from life, which was very difficult at the end, into death. And you may have certain feelings of euphoria and jubilation around that time. However, when it comes to the funeral and you walk into the crematorium or the church or wherever the service is happening, you're confronted with a coffin, perhaps for the first time. That may be a moment where you feel your knees buckle, your breathing becomes difficult, and you may suddenly start to feel, gosh, I was feeling confident, but now I'm not so sure that I can do this. Think about that a lot in the run-up. When you're practicing your speech, think about that. Prepare yourself that you're going to be greeted by this scene, so that you are ready for it when it comes to it. It is okay to cry. That's the place for crying, is at a funeral. It's that time to say goodbye, so it's okay. The difficulty with tears, if you are one of the people who's speaking, is when you're crying or choked up with emotion. It can make it really, really hard for you to get your words out. So take some deep breaths and practice this before, whenever you're doing your speech. And when you're doing your speech rehearsal, just try and get into that moment. Take some deep breaths in and out before you speak, and just try and get yourself into that zone so that you're prepared. Crying is absolutely fine, but you need to get yourself in a place mentally where you can get your words out. That may mean mentally removing yourself from the fact that you're at a funeral just for those 3 minutes, so that you can get across those things that you wanted to say. If it means that you need to read from a piece of paper, that's absolutely fine. If you're struggling to make eye contact and look up and look at the congregation, the people that are gathered there, that's absolutely fine too, because you will be looking into faces of people who are feeling an enormous amount of distress, and you may also be hearing people sobbing, and that can be really, really difficult. So remind yourself of that when you're preparing, and focus on your words, focus on what you're reading so that you can get those words out. So rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. When you're rehearsing, even if it's not on on an occasion that's so emotionally charged as a funeral, a really good rule of thumb is, if you're rehearsing something and you get to a point and you cannot get the words out without crying, cut those words out. Seriously, if in rehearsal you can't get past them without crying, you will not get past them when it comes to the real thing, and you don't want that to happen. Particularly going back to when we're talking about preparing what you're going to say, think about those last couple of lines, because that's when you'll get choked up. The choking up with tears tends to happen right at the beginning. Once you get into your flow, it's kind of okay, and then right at the end. Think about those summing up words very carefully, and remember what I said earlier. That's when it can be really helpful to do a poem instead, because it's not your own words that you're speaking there. Do remember that you will be standing next to a coffin of the person that you love, and you'll be facing people who are very upset. You don't have to look at them. It's okay not to. It's okay to focus on what you're saying. You can just focus on a microphone that's in front of you, focus on the piece of paper with your words on, or focus on the lectern or whatever you've got directly in front of you, and take yourself out of that situation mentally, if that's what's helpful to you. And remember to breathe. Take a moment. You're understanding now why I said don't prepare 3 minutes if you've got 3 minutes. Prepare 2.5 or 2 minutes, so that you can take those moments to give yourself a moment and to remember to breathe. Really important. Moving on to our next slide about being prepared. Now, while you're talking, you may wish to look at the family, but don't worry if you can't. It really doesn't matter. There'll be all sorts of things going on in their minds. They may be trying really hard not to cry, to keep their emotions under control. One of them may be speaking next, and they're just not listening to what you're saying. So if you do look at them and they're not looking at you, don't take that personally. It's such a difficult time for them. If you can look up and look around to the congregation, that's lovely. That's a lovely thing to do. But if you can't, don't worry. It's all right. If anything, people are thinking, my goodness, that person who is speaking is incredibly brave. I would never have the courage to do what they're doing. You don't have to look up. You don't have to make eye contact. With any other kind of public speaking, that's really important. But at a funeral, you can let yourself off the hook with that. That's not so important. Thinking about the breathing again and how difficult it can be to speak when you're crying and when you're choked up with emotion. It's kind of the lungs and the throat, and where it feels like that emotion is really palpable. It feels really real. You can meditate beforehand. You can meditate to yourself before speaking when you're doing your practices, and go back into that meditative space when you're speaking, so that you have a calm rhythm to your voice when you're talking. Stick to your prepared speech. Now, you may actually suffer some overconfidence when you get up there. You're thinking, well, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. It's okay. And there's a nice light atmosphere here. Still stick to your prepared speech. If you go off-piste and start improvising, you will mess up your timing, and you may start saying things that are not the best idea. Stick to what you've prepared. It will serve you well. If it all goes well, don't think, well, I'm going to stick in something additional here that I hadn't planned to. Don't. When you're finished, finish, and that's the time to step down and let the next person speak, or let the next thing in the order of service happen. And drink water. Drink lots of water before you get up there. You can take a glass of water up there with you. There may be one up there on the podium. And it's absolutely fine to stop to take a drink of water to make sure that you've got a voice to speak with. If you've been crying, that can really dehydrate you. So make sure that you drink plenty of water so you're able to keep on speaking. Let's finally go on and talk about emotions. As I've said, be prepared for your own emotions to surprise you. And you may not be somebody that ever cries. This may turn out to be the first time, and that's absolutely fine. Don't worry too much about how you're feeling. Focus on the speech that you've prepared. Practice, practice, practice beforehand, and focus on that speech. At Giraffe Sense, we have done a previous webcast that was all about mindfulness meditation, and that's available now as a downloadable that you can purchase from us via our website at giraffesense.co.uk, and that was with a mindfulness meditation trainer, Anne Murray. If you'd like to download that, you may find that really helpful. Mindfulness meditation can really help you to prepare for this very emotionally charged of public speaking occasions. It is perfectly okay to cry. Don't beat yourself up if you do find the tears start to flow. Take a moment to breathe and focus back on your speech and try and get your words out. Take a sip of water. Give yourself a moment. You don't have to panic because you've left additional time. You've only prepared 2.5 minutes to speak, so you've got time just to take a breath. And it can really help you to pause, to clear your mind and focus, and perhaps use an anchoring technique. You may be wondering what an anchoring technique is. Well, my next live webinar, which is on the 18th of December at 8 p.m. UK time, is all about how to beat public speaking anxiety, and during that you'll learn about anchoring techniques that can really help you to overcome moments of panic or when your mind goes really blank when you're speaking. I'll talk about that again before we finish. Smile. Yes, it is a funeral, but it's also a celebration of somebody's life, so don't be afraid to smile, and also to put some smile into your voice when you're speaking. The purpose of speaking, after all, is to bring comfort, so feel relaxed about smiling if that feels natural to you. And just remember again, that last sentence is the most difficult for you. So think about what your last sentence may be, and it may be more appropriate that it is a reading, if that is easier for you. Now, I have had some questions come through, so if I may, I'm just going to take some time to answer those for you now. Thank you so much for sending them through. So what's great about these live webcasts is that it does give me an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have. The first one that's come through is from Tracy. Yes, it's a question that I get asked a lot when it comes to speaking at funerals, and it's this. Tracy asks, is it a good idea to have a drink, she's put whiskey in brackets, to calm your nerves? Yeah, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Some people like to have a little bit of drink, alcoholic drink, to calm themselves down, or another substance. I think I'm going to have to name some brand names here. Pro Plus, or Red Bull. People often ask me about those as well. I'm not saying an outright no to those things, but if you're the sort of person who takes a sip of alcohol and is immediately drunk, and you know if you are, then don't do it. It's not a good idea. However, if you can take what they call a medicinal sip of whiskey or something like that, just to take the edge off, I don't see why not. But let me assure you, the funeral speech is no place to be drunk. Absolutely not. And it's disrespectful towards the family. And that's when you're likely to not stick to your script and to say things that are inappropriate. Don't do it. But if a little drop of something helps you calm your nerves, the same with smoking. I don't smoke and I don't condone it. But if you smoke cigarettes, it calms your nerves before you speak, why not? But I honestly would steer clear of anything more stimulating than that. Red Bull, Pro Plus, anything with a lot of caffeine in, like a strong espresso, or any other type of stimulants. Don't do it. It's absolutely not the time to do it. So just be careful. Thank you for that question, Tracy. Got another one that's coming from Peter. Hi, Peter. Peter asks, I need to speak at my brother's funeral. How honest should I be? That's always tricky, isn't it? When you've got this huge mix of people who are listening to you speak. You have the family members, I said earlier, and you've got friends there and people who've worked with the person. And you might have a few anecdotes that really sum up your brother's life. But are they appropriate? Well, ask somebody else, before you say it. Perhaps show somebody your speech who's a member of the family and say, do you think this will be okay? And if they say no, then listen to them. And don't say that thing, save it for another occasion. Or perhaps afterwards when there's a wake and you're talking to friends and family, that may be a time to share. But otherwise, just kind of be careful. It's different to a best man's speech. But yeah, be honest. I mean, don't lie. Never lie at a funeral, because there's lots of other people there who know the person just as well as you do, if not better. And it's about remembering the person and what was great about that person, and trying to bring that person into the room, if you like, and bring back their personality into the room. So it's lovely. Do share anecdotes. That's a great thing to do, but keep them light and maybe slightly humorous so that people will smile and think, yeah, I really remember that. It's not the time for shocks. It's not the time for anecdotes that had anything to do with being drunk at the time, or for revelations that another member of the family may not know. But don't be afraid to, as I say, kind of bring the person's personality back into the room. I've got one more question that's come through. This is from Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Sarah says, I'm really scared about seeing the coffin. Yeah, that's understandable. How do I overcome this? I don't think I'll even be able to stand up. It's tricky, so be prepared. That's why it's important to have your speech on a piece of paper, as you may need to ask somebody else to read it for you. I have seen this happen a number of times, particularly with younger people. Sometimes parents want their children to be able to express themselves at a funeral, but it's really, really difficult, and I wouldn't underestimate the power of seeing a coffin. If you've never been to a funeral before, you have to stand next to it. You see television and films and perhaps funerals that are televised, as we said at the beginning, and it seems like no big deal. It's a very big deal to stand next to a coffin. So all of the things that I've said already really come into play. If you are scared, really palpably scared, I think you might have a panic attack, it can be a good idea to see a counsellor, a hypnotherapist, or speak to your GP about that. Because if you really want to speak but you're afraid that your emotions are going to make it physically difficult, your knees are going to buckle and you're going to have a panic attack, then do seek a bit of extra help about that. We'll speak to the undertaker or the minister or whoever is conducting the service, because they have looked after people hundreds and hundreds of times in these sorts of situations. So don't be afraid to ask them about what you should do. Unless we have any more questions coming through, I can't see any more at the moment. That's really it. I hope you found that very helpful to you. You're very welcome to drop me an email and let me know how you're getting on. with preparing your speeches, or indeed if you do give a speech after this, drop me an email at julie@giraffesense.co.uk. Let me know how you got on with it. I'd love to hear. Thank you so much for coming along this evening. My name is Julie Howell and my company is Giraffe Sense, and I'm a public speaking coach. I coach people to do public speaking in all kinds of different environments. I regularly run these webinars. Most of them are priced and we have guest speakers, but occasionally ones like this one are free. I would love to hear from you if you need any kind of support doing public speaking, whether you've spoken before and you just would like to be better at public speaking, or if it's all new to you and you've got a lot of anxiety about it, or would just like to make sure that you do a good job of speaking, whether it's through your work or at a social event, or indeed speaking at a funeral. That's something where I can help. My contact details are on the screen at the moment. My website, giraffesense.co.uk, and my email address is julie@giraffesense.co.uk. Also, I always mention that I run an online community for people with multiple sclerosis. Everybody tends to know somebody else who's got MS, so do direct them to that, please. It's www.mswebpals.org. We're nearly up to time. Thank you so much for your time and your attention this evening, and I hope that you found that session useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.